Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our little chat every day about the penguins on my wall, that wall behind me. I originally intended to finish up last year's library tour with a tour of the Penguin Wall because the penguins mean a lot to me. They tend to mean more to me. They are certainly the books that I revisit and inhabit and live with more than any other books I have, by far. For instance, in the type of all or nothing Casino Royale scenario that is often proposed to me, what would you do if you had only so many books? If you could have only so many books? For years and years and years, my answer to that question would have been, well, it would be very painful, but if it came to it, that's what I would want. Just give me that wall, and you can take the rest. Lately, in the 21st century, and especially in 2020, my answer to that is a slightly bit more nuanced because I am starting to think more and more about my library as electronic rather than printed, which must be heresy to a lot of you and would certainly have been heretical to me for most of my life to look at this little room absolutely saturated with books. Absolutely, actually not absolutely saturated with books. There is an empty bookcase right next to me. I filled one shelf of it with mass market paperbacks, but the main shelves for full-size books are empty still. But for most of my life, anywhere that I went, whether it was on board a ship or it was in a house or it was in an apartment or whatever, I would always make a space like this. I can live in the tiniest amount of space like this because I don't, unlike most people, I don't require a solid 15 hours of space of living in that space to be done unconsciously, rolling around in drooling sleep. Sleep is an afterthought for me, so I can live in a closet without any discomfort at all. This room is a little bit big along those lines, but I've been here for a long time and I like it. And for most of those years, it would have seemed heresy to me to talk about an electronic library. But And I'm not meaning to say that the one is replacing the other, but typically what I have done in the years when I've had this penguin wall was to be sitting up in bed, propped up on pillows, the way God intended. That's the way I do literally everything. As I've said many times on this channel, I would shower there if I could. Lately, in the past, when I have been in that position and I've been reading something, some new book, and I've come across some need or want, author mentions something and I think, that's from Gibbon, or that's connected to Gibbon, and suddenly you want to read that particular chapter on the unabridged Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. In the past, what I've had to do is shift the dogs who are inevitably sleeping on top of me, get up, walk over, find that copy, turn on enough lights to see it, and then dig through it for what I'm looking for. That was a huge percentage of what I did against that wall. And that is true recently as well, only with one little dog who doesn't need much dislodging. If you so much as move in Frida's company, she could be sound asleep. She's still going to get up and wonder what you're doing. You're not going to need, right now anyway, when she's older, I'll need to shift her. But right now, she doesn't need any shifting. She just needs to let me know that I need to get out of the way. But in 2020, that age-old procedure has been badly challenged by a new procedure, which is, a lot of you have been very generous to me in sending me EPUBs and Mobi files and PDFs of ebooks, including quite a few classics and quite a few works of history, works of fiction, all that sort of thing. You never know what's going to crop up in your reading that's going to send you to your bookshelves. And many times in 2020, I have been propped up in bed on pillows with a little schnauzer sleeping on my belly, and I have suddenly hit that old familiar snag. I'd better double check this or triple check that, and suddenly not needed to move at all. I haven't needed to move at all. I've just needed to go to my ebook library, find the book, and then even then, no ruffling around, no need to turn on lights because the tablet provides its own, and no need to ruffle around in the book because I can just ask the book where the thing is that I'm looking for. I can just tap the little magnifying glass icon and say, I'm looking for Cordoba. Find it for me. Find every mention in this text, no matter how big it is, of Cordoba. Do it in 2 seconds. But for a long time, these would have been the essential books that I would not have let go. This would have been my essential library. And so I thought that'd make a perfect conclusion to a year-long library tour, but I mistimed things, as I tend to do. I tend to think I have the whole of the month of December, and I don't. I have less than half the month of December. So I ran out of time. So we're doing a daily Penguin, and we're just going through the whole collection from front to start. And that is causing us to encounter a whole bunch of weird and miscellaneous stuff. You've been seeing that. For a while, I spoiled you all because we had a fairly ordered beginning. That wasn't an intention on my part. It just happened that once upon a time, a long time ago, I started organizing my Penguins, and I naturally started with the literature of the ancient world. So we were doing that for a long time, but that's a long time past. Now it's been just everywhere. Although I seem to sense in a lot of what we're looking at the 19th century, the broad 19th century. So maybe that is the case. That is certainly the case with today's book, which is not only a great work of nonfiction for the 20th century, but one of the ultimate encomiums to the 19th century. This is the education of Henry Adams, who was the grandson of John Quincy Adams and the great-grandson of John Adams, who's part of a storied literary family in New England. He was a friend in Washington to all the movers and shakers, especially John Hay. He was also an enemy to, or a frenemy, as we would put it now, to many elected political officials, including Theodore Roosevelt. And he had a gigantic brain, a brain that all the Adams did, but his especially, encompassed everything and looked at it with a kind of wry amusement, including himself. It is a common refrain, it was a common refrain among some of his enemies in his own day, to line up the rather pallid, study-bound, bookwormy pursuits of his own life against the accomplishments of some of his ancestors, ambassadors, presidents, two of them. Two were eminent historians of the day, massively eminent historians, and stodgy but very readable historians. Whereas Henry Adams tended to lounge, he tended to complain, he tended to socialize with his friends, and brooded on his own loves and dislikes in private. He did write an enormous work of history that, in my opinion, stands him shoulder to shoulder with his historian kin. His account, he wrote a massive 6 or 7 volume account of a formative period in American history, the earliest period of American politics. And it's terrific. It really is. It's in a 2-volume set by the Library of America, and it's well worth your time to read. He also wrote fiction that was ill-advised, and he wrote a book that sold really well called Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres. But the whole time he was being bothered, he knew perfectly well, better than anybody, in fact, the number one thing to say about Henry Adams is that he was smarter than almost anybody in his own time, with only one exception, also from Boston. Some of you will know the exception I'm talking about. I'll give you a little hint. He spent some time on the Supreme Court. Adams was smarter than almost anybody, and was observing not only his whole time period as he lived through it, but himself living through it. And it bothered him, not only those shades of unmeasurable ancestors and their accomplishments, but also rapid change. The transition between the 19th century and the 20th century had plenty of harbingers of what was to come. It was pretty clear that Thomas Jefferson's idea of an agrarian state, an agrarian country, was not going to win out over Hamilton's idea of an industrial country, an urban country. It was pretty clear, even at the end of the 19th century, that that was the case. And by the beginning of the 20th century, there was no mistaking it. There was radiation that was under man's control. There were cars. There was radio. There were all kinds of things that didn't exist in the youth of people who were not very old when the century changed. And anybody looking at those things could see their potential to change the world. And of course they did. And nobody saw that better than Adams. And it bothered him as much as it pleased him, because he felt ill-equipped. He felt ill-equipped anyway throughout most of his life. He was an extremely ingrown toenail, a self-doubter of magnificent proportions. He married a wonderful woman who did her best to change that in him, and then she died, and he was wrecked by that, absolutely wrecked by it. And the whole time that all these events were happening, this book, The Education of Henry Adams, was percolating in him. It is a strange book, and it is overwhelmingly brilliant, just incredible. And it doesn't read like what you might expect. On this Penguin Classic cover, there's, of course, a faded black and white photo of a fairly Boston Brahmin-y, stodgy type figure. You would never guess, as I often say about these Penguin Classics, you would never guess from the outward accoutrements of this book how alive it is, how absolutely alive it is. And it is, among many other things, it is a memoir in its own way. It's a little bit pretentious, obviously, as you can tell, because even the title gives away that Adams refers to himself in the third person the whole time. And believe me, that was grating on people of reading sensibilities even when he did it in the early 20th century. It's almost unthinkable now, and except that it has transmuted into autofiction, which is even worse. But this is not just a meditation on his inadequacy to face the new century, the dynamo of technological progress, as he called it. And it's also not just a melancholy and nostalgic reflection on simpler days, on easier days at Harvard, or walking across Boston Common with John Quincy Adams holding him by the hand. It's more than that, and that saves it. That makes it immortal. What it really is the anguished and excited cry of realization of a tremendously intelligent mind that an era is changing. And that makes it evergreen. Right? That makes it every much as evergreen now. We are almost exactly 100 years from when Adams wrote this. It came out, he published this in 1918 after first circulating it among a group of people. Adams' biographers often refer to that group of people as a group of friends. That does him less credit than he deserves. He also sent it to enemies. He had it privately printed in so that they wouldn't be flopping around pages, and he sent it to a whole bunch of people, those original copies. I often wonder if a book antiquarian or a collector of some kind, somebody far more knowledgeable in that field than I am, could tell me whether or not those original, you couldn't even call them presentation copies, trial balloon copies, are valuable. But he sent them around. He sent them to people whose opinions he would respect one way or another. And quite a few of those people, even during those early years, with that privately printed volume, quite a few of those people said, well, okay, we expected you to write a memoir and maybe to name names in that memoir, but this isn't that. This is far, far beyond that. Whatever you're doing here, this is genius. But he insisted that it be published only after he died, and so it was published in 1918 and promptly won a prize, all the prizes in major. I think it was the Pulitzer Prize for literature. Which one did this one win? It won a major prize. It might have been the Nobel Prize. No, it wasn't the Nobel Prize. It was I don't know if this is going to tell me. This edition is edited by Jean Gooder, and if it doesn't tell me, that's going to say a lot about her, about the job that Jean Gooder is doing. No, it doesn't. This quick synopsis at the beginning doesn't really tell me, but it won a major prize immediately, and then fell into a little bit of obscurity. Although there were quite a few people who praised it. I think it was the Pulitzer Prize that it won. One way or another, Adams insisted that it not come out until after his death, and I don't know why. Because there's not a whole lot in here that's scandalous to any living person. And even the parts that are, there are a couple of people whose names crop up that maybe might not have been happy with some of the ways they're characterized. Even they, if you read the thing instead of hunting backwards from the index, if you read it and get caught up in the reading experience, you're not going to care. The genius that those friends and enemies spotted in this thing when it was circulated privately is obvious from the beginning. And that genius takes the form of this intelligent person grappling with modernity. You will often hear thumbnail descriptions of this book calling it a modernist classic. But it's more than that. It's modernism looking at modernism. And looking at all the factors, the surging changes that identify any iteration of modernism at the beginning of any era. Which is why this is so easy to read now. It speaks directly to the reader now. With the internet and social media and deep fakes and all the technological marvels and terrors that surround us today, Adams would have been right at home. He would have been right at home writing a book like this. It is effectively about our own time in a way that, for instance, it wouldn't have been about the 1880s, and in a way that it wouldn't have been about the 1950s. there are eras where change is in the air, where fundamental pillars are shifting and wobbling a bit. Those errors are the ones that Adams is writing about in this book. And the prose is great, greater than anything else he ever did. So, so your Penguin Classic today is a huge recommend. This book has slightly been revived. It's in the Penguin Classic line. I think Modern Library listed as one of the great nonfiction works of the 20th century. I was very happy to see that when it happened. I think that list came out when I was working in a bookstore. I had a number of people come up to me and say, "What do you make of this list? I'm not gonna sink any money into this thing until I know whether it has your agreement or not." And I said, "Well, the fiction list we can talk about until the cows come home, but the nonfiction list has some great stuff on it, and one of them is The Education of Henry Adams. If you had to read a segment of this in school or something and have forgotten about it, read the whole thing. You're going to love it." And I never had any customer or friend tell me that wasn't true. It's, of course, it's a very much a 19th century diction, although Adams' brain, watching his brain at work, is amazing. It's a very much a 19th century diction, so you have to be prepared for that. And you also have to go into it on his terms rather than expecting it to be a memoir. Because there's 20 years that are missing right in the middle of this story. Adams would not write about his wife. So there's a gap. There have been many, many points in this book's publication history where a publisher brought it out in 2 volumes, one before and one after. Because there's a huge hole in the middle of this book. Adams barely mentions his wife. I think at one point in the book he mentions that the beautiful Rock Creek Cemetery memorial that St. Gaudens did to her has started to attract pilgrims on its own, people who didn't know her and who weren't going there to mourn her. They were going there to look at this statue. And if you have ever seen that statue, or especially sat across from it, there's a bench for you to sit across from it, you will know why. It is one of that artist's greatest works and one of the greatest funerary monuments in the world. But the normal thing that you would expect, today we met, this day we fell in love, here we had our marriage and our honeymoon. No, that's all for him. That's not for you. He's got other things to tell you about. And I think it's a wise decision. I think the one thing this book is not is maudlin. So your Penguin Classic today, I could go on. I don't know if you can tell. Some of you have emailed me and said, boy, when you can give a 2-hour seminar about a book, it's pretty obvious when you stop at 18 minutes. And this is one of those times. I could go on and on about this book, but instead I will merely recommend it. If it's on your shelf, if it's on your radar and you've always thought about it and maybe need a little nudge, consider that nudge. This is terrific. I don't know what we're going to encounter tomorrow. It's going to be downhill from The Education of Henry Adams, I suspect. So we shall see. But I'm glad to have it. I hope I haven't done it already. I'm pretty sure I only have one copy of The Education of Henry Adams. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now. That was your Penguin Classic. I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.